140 feature, and this time we talk about intra-Africa trade. So Africa's future lies not only in exporting raw materials but in creating value here at home. So we speak to a woman who's making that vision very real. Nontwenhle Mchunu is CEO and co-founder of DiTau Africa. From crafting premium chocolates to driving trade through SIAFTRA Summit, she's connecting African entrepreneurs, policymakers and markets under the AfCFTA banner. We explore what it really takes for trade across Africa, the opportunities, the barriers, and the boldness to make it happen. Nontwenhle Mchunu began as a chocolatier, as we mentioned, turning Africa's finest cocoa into a luxury chocolate. Today, through DiTau Africa and the SIAFTRA platform, she helps others trade, scale, and succeed across the continent. Nontwenhle, welcome to Africa World Hour. So our first conversation, I think we somehow got there, and I was fascinated by the story you met at the African
Africa
Energy Week. Can you see my brain is already... So it was an intense conference, but I was quite fascinated to meet somebody like you at African Energy Week. And just tell me how you made that pivot from making chocolates to saying, I want to form a company that promotes intra-Africa trade.
Firstly, good evening to you, Tsepiso, to your listeners and viewers. It's fascinating that radio is now
right?
A TV channel. So I trained as a chocolatier with a vision to create a premium African chocolate, because cocoa is one of our, in the agricultural space is the biggest export in Africa. So I wanted to create an African premium chocolate to change that picture so that Africans can also participate in the beneficiation of their own raw material. So that's how I started my journey in the chocolate space. But then I soon found out that it's not just chocolate, it's not just cocoa, it's across board. Our minerals or raw materials are only good for export, not local beneficiation, which is something that needs to change, because then as Africans we benefit the least in our own
so not that right, because you have been in the industry, is it something that's foisted upon us, or is it just the bad decisions that we make? Because then when we get into deals with other countries, as you're saying, I mean, I love the idea, because when we think about chocolate, we say Belgian chocolate is the best, but as you say, the raw material comes from here. Cote d'Ivoire is the biggest producer of cocoa.
I think it's structural. We take it for granted that we live in a system that we did not create, and we somehow, because we were free politically, we thought then we are emancipated in also economically. So we didn't take time to understand the structure that we inherited and to almost reimagine it. And look at how does the structure that we inherited, how can it serve Africa, and how can we make it our own. And we do not invest in our own structures across board. So it's about reimagining what we want Africa to be and investing in getting there.
And I suppose it also comes down to the mentality, realizing that we no longer need permission in terms of ownership. But this is why we have had years and years of negotiations about the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, because there are those salient issues when it comes to laws of origin, those complications, and yet we want to say we want to scale up business between African countries. So just tell me about why is it so complex, and also talk to me about moving quality ingredients across borders. What are the complications that you experience that you think are lessons to learn for people who have those ambitions?
I think as a continent, we over-negotiate. We do not really drive. We want to see. So the complex around the continent is that even the borders that we have, we inherited. It was a meeting with white men around the room who decided that we want to take that part of Africa, you take this one, you take this one. And we now reinforce those
barriers.
Barriers. And the AU came with a vision to unite us as Africans. But unfortunately, what did not happen was the messaging for the African child to understand the impact of uniting Africa. So the barriers then are actually sometimes self-imposed. We impose these barriers ourselves because we keep them in place instead of us as Africans from ground up actually to say we do not want to be separated as we are, because there is a case to be proven that a cross-border trade is what is going to get us to a real economic freedom.
So tell us about then the SIAFTRA summit. How does that help along that vision, including of the remnants of what still needs to be negotiated with the AfCFTA in terms of certification, packaging, logistics, all of those things that are proving to be tough as red tape?
So maybe just a little bit of why we do what we do as DiTau Africa is someone has to do the dirty work, I call it, where you actually get Africans to say, we have to work together. And these are the barriers that exist. Traveling within this continent is more expensive than traveling outside of the continent, and that has to change. Connection, like communication within the continent, is expensive. Everything is expensive. So an example, back to chocolate, it's cheaper to import from Europe than it would be to buy cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire. So it is a lot of structure that needs to change. So then the SIAFTRA summit is about stimulating trade within the African continent, so intra-Africa trade. And why we do this as a private business is that we understand that it is the government's business to set policy. It is private entities and SMMEs who need to then drive the change. We can't sit on the sidelines when our future is being decided. I think that's the mistake that we are all making, is that we're waiting
for somebody
to make the change for us.
So then tell me, how do African entrepreneurs fully understand not only these chains that they are imprisoned to, and by that, as you mentioned, it's the laws, it's our historical context within which we do trade, but we keep talking about doing it better. What is failing us? Just from what you're encountering as a business, there was a lot of talk about how you need to make bankable projects work and appealing. But what is that? What is stopping us?
What is stopping us? I think it's a willingness. First of all, I think from politically down to the men on the street, we need to be willing to change. The infrastructure is not correct. The policies that govern our trade, it's not correct. So we need to talk about what needs to change and actually actively do it. So the finance, I always talk about financial institutions in South Africa. They do not understand the indigenous ownership of land. It is not the land ownership that has to change as much as it is the institution who need to understand how our land is governed. So there's so much that we we cut and paste from Europe and the rest of the world to run our economies, and that needs to change.
So when we talk about financing mechanisms, how are we going to turn it around that we are going to export that premium chocolate to Europe now?
I call it a stubborn backing. We've over the years we've been slaves and willingly gave our equity, our intellectual property to the rest of the world, and it is time now to back ourselves. We need to and the countries that, I mean, if you look at countries that are successful in entrepreneurship, are countries that have systems that are resilient in backing the entrepreneur. And in African countries, that's not really true. A person gets one shot at doing anything. If they don't succeed, they're cancelled. So the cancel culture is so prevalent in Africa, where we cannot afford to do it.
And we don't necessarily have the skills or the know-how, but you're still expected to get it right the first time around.
I wouldn't say so. I personally, in my chocolate journey, I had the best skills. I can tell you that right now. I made the best chocolate. I made the best chocolate, had the best support. But when you come as a black child to say, I need 100 million, you cannot get it, because there are so many reasons why a black child cannot access that as opposed to anyone else.
So what would then be defined as a good project conversion rate, and what would be needed?
That's a very loaded question.
So I'm just thinking, if we're talking about scaling up, we can't keep being talking about what we need to fix. We need to hit the ground running. So if we're talking these are bankable projects, what are the metrics? What are the hallmarks of these?
So we need to talk about first of all institutions of research that are accessible to entrepreneurs. I call it a corporate of entrepreneurs, because that then would de-risk any project and give support to entrepreneurs, where you give all the necessary support to the project or to the entrepreneur, so that when they then need finance, you know that in terms of their accounting, their R&Ds is taken care of. Their standards, because if talk about food, you have to have food standards that you before you supply anyone. So until we have a basket of all the support that the entrepreneur needs, and we do it in a systematic way, we really cannot succeed in really building sustainable businesses
from the ground up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nontwenhle. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you. As the AfCFTA takes root, entrepreneurs like Nontwenhle Mchunu are proving that Africa's trade story is being rewritten from the ground up, from DiTau Africa to SIAFTRA. She's turning policy into practice.